Good morning. Nice to see everybody here. What a crowd. Walt, congratulations on putting together a wonderful breakfast. So many people here. I had trouble finding a spot in the parking lot, and I even got kicked out of the City of Edwardsville table. There's so many people here. I had to sit at a different table this morning. But a year ago, I stood in front of you and said that our community was poised for development. And of course, at the city, we know a little bit about the background. We see some of the projects coming in, so that was loaded knowing that it was poised for development. And as you drive around the community today, you can see projects going on. It's actually exciting to go to work or to drive around and see the vertical buildings coming up, the road improvements that we were able to achieve, as well as a couple of our park acquisitions. But to give you some numbers with those investments, we had 1,246 construction permits last year. There are communities that are happy with 2 or 3 dozen permits a year. 1,246 permits is fantastic. We hit a construction value of $248 million, setting a new high, exceeding our previous high that was in 2016 of $154 million. To take you back a few years, when I first started as mayor, we had $43 million worth of construction permits, compared to this year, $248 million. Thank you. And it certainly is. It's a joy to work with our investors and our partners, and certainly our city staff. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes into those permits, from inspections to making sure that the roads and the water and the sewer are all ready to go. A couple highlights that I would like to touch on, and I know I only have 5 minutes, but there's a lot of neat projects this year, so I apologize for running over a little bit here. But Whispering Heights, I saw the investors here this morning for Whispering Heights, 153 apartment homes, as well as 1,800 square feet of retail and restaurant space, so that's on 157, a very exciting project. We have Richland Residential, which is also known as the Reserve. It's a 486-bed student housing complex that's being built out on New Pogue Road. There's 9 buildings there and a clubhouse and a pool. I tell you, if you want to go back to college, it's a great time to go back to college. Places are amazing. I remember my roommate and I deciding, how we could fit the twin beds in that room that we had to split with the cinder block walls. But Town Center, out on 157 across from SIUE, that's where the Madison Mutual building used to be, and that's a very exciting project, which will have 197 luxury apartment and mixed-use commercial, as well as 6 outlots. Kloss Furniture is under construction there right now. And Ironworks, which is near Planet Fitness, or First to the Finish. That is a 2,200 square feet retail strip center. I know Sugar Fire Barbecue, Strange Donuts, Chicken Salad Chicks, a couple other really nice eateries, as well as Global Brew will be in that location. Not only are we building new, but it's exciting to drive down Troy Road, or 159, and see the renovations that have taken place at Montclair Shopping Center. One of our oldest shopping centers from the 1960s, completely new facade, new parking lot, new lights. Very impressive to see new retail shops going in there. And a little further down where Schnucks is, we have, or our Schnucks are, both of them. We have Edwardsville Marketplace that has some new tenants, and as well as completely renovated. I just didn't think we needed any more banks, dental offices, or pizza places, but I just ate at the new Mod Pizza, and it was fantastic. So if you get a chance to visit that, that's in Edwardsville Marketplace. Other big projects, Worldwide Technology. We're so pleased to have them as a member of our community. They are building 2 1 million square foot warehouses, a campus of technology down off 255. It's an amazing process. I was down there one time last year, and there were 100 concrete finishers working on those little hovercraft, smoothing up the foundation. And if you drive by 2 weeks later, you're seeing the walls come up. So it's awesome to have Worldwide with us. And in downtown, we saw a total of 68 commercial building permits for a total of $16 million. That's the equivalent of the last 4 years combined. So $16 million last year, exceeding the previous 4 years pretty significantly. The city has continued to put our investments in as well. You can see the roads from Troy Road being remodeled, St. Louis Street being completely rebuilt. We'll have major road projects this year to include Hale Avenue, 5th Avenue. We're going to redo the signal timing on 159, working with our neighbors in Glen Carbon to make those more efficient, and also some multi-use paths on 157 for pedestrian use and to make that roadway safer for pedestrians and the retail that's going out there. We also have an exciting project. Most of you have heard about Plummer Family Park. Tonight we will be voting on that at the City Council. It would include 6 soccer fields. City of Edwardsville has never owned a soccer field in our history, so we will be adding 6, hopefully, with 2 all-surface synthetic fields and 4 ball diamonds, all synthetic ball diamonds for softball as well as youth baseball. It'll have 821 parking spaces, 1.4 miles of walking trails, 215 trees. For those of you that know me, I'm pretty happy about 215 trees, and 1,000 feet of roadway. So that's a little bit about what the city is doing to continue to invest and attract business. The other projects that we know that are coming this year, the Gorey Julian building, which will be downtown. It's a 5-story office building in downtown Edwardsville. There's some exciting things happening over at First Mid-Bank site, which is near St. Louis Street. And we have the county's property. I saw Chairman here today. We're working on the 15 acres that's near the Deerbergs complex. We have a great proposal for some townhomes and some retail space there. And we're so happy to announce that Anderson Hospital will be breaking ground on a surgical center across from the new YMCA on Goshen Road this year. So it's going to be another busy, exciting year. And I'll summarize, I'll end here as quickly as possible since I know I've gone past my 5 minutes, Walt. I apologize. But you can't grow this community like you've grown at Walt and not give me, at least 8 minutes. But Edwardsville remains poised, prepped, and ready for new business development. I appreciate the hard work and dedication of our department heads and employees that make our community attractive for our citizens and investors. Our goal under my administration has always been and always will be to encourage a bustling economic development activity while maintaining and building upon the strengths of our neighborhoods and our families. Edwardsville, as I like to say, it's a place of 26,000 people. We have 25,000 students learning here. We have 40,000 people that work here, and we have 100,000 each year that come and entertain here. So thank you very much for being here this morning. I look forward to coming back and announcing our business of the year, and have a great year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Those investment totals are exciting news for the city of Edwardsville, and these new investments are a testament to the leadership that he's provided and how Edwardsville is viewed in the marketplace. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 5th Annual City of Edwardsville Business Forecast Breakfast. My name is Steve Jankowski, and I'm very happy to serve as your moderator, MC, whatever the title would be. Walt, I guess moderator would be as good as anything. And it is a pleasure to be here this morning. After nearly 40 years in the broadcast business, I retired in June of last year, so if you need anybody to come do voice work, to walk your dogs, to take care of your grandkids, I'm available. Happily retired, and it's been a joy. So if those of you who are thinking about it, don't hesitate. It's a great thing to jump into. This is my first year as host, and I'm happy to be here. Walter Williams, Community Economic Development Director for the City of Edwardsville, has told me that this event has grown every year since it started 5 years ago. The first year attracted 109 business leaders, and today there were 280 people registered for the event. So we thank you very, very much for your support, and you give yourself a round of applause. We are also honored to have in our midst several elected officials and public servants, and I'd ask these individuals to stand to be recognized, and please hold your applause until the end. County Board Chairman Kurt Prenzler, Alderman Jack Burns, Alderwoman Janet Stack, Alderman S.J. Morrison, Alderman Craig Lauer, Judge Ryan Jumper, Chief Jay Keevan, and Fire Chief Rick Welly. Would you all please stand and be recognized? And if I miss anybody, I apologize, and welcome, and thank you for being here. As we continue, the City of Edwardsville Business Forecast Breakfast event is designed to equip you with information you can use to help predict how the national, state, and local economy, as well as leading indicators, will affect your business. More importantly, this event will provide you a longer-term look at how growth may influence Edwardsville's economy way into the future. Specifically, we will share information that business owners and managers need to understand as the core drivers of the economy to enable you to leverage opportunities created from this economic growth. So where are we in this current economic cycle? And what changes, disruptors, and trends lay ahead? At this year's event, we brought together two economists to help provide your business with the information it needs to understand and capitalize on these opportunities. Two economists in the same room. That leads me to this. A mathematician, an accountant, and an accountant apply for the same job. The interview calls in the mathematician and says, "What does 2 plus 2 equal?" The mathematician says, 4. The interviewer asks, 4 exactly? The mathematician looks at the interviewer incredulously and says, "Yes, 4 exactly." Then the interviewer calls in the accountant and asks the same question. "What does 2 plus 2 equal?" The accountant says, "On average 4, give or take 10%, but on average 4. Then the interviewer calls in the economist and poses the same question. "What does 2 plus 2 equal?" The economist gets up, locks the door, closes the shade, sits down next to the interviewer and says, "What do you want it to equal?" Boy, ran into a lot of people during the news business with that one. All right, let's move on with our agenda. First on our agenda is one of those two economists, and this is no joke. This gentleman is the real, genuine article. Dr. Tim Sullivan, professor of the economics department at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Dr. Sullivan is an expert on providing insight into local employment and economic indicators, national and regional business lending trends, and insight as to how Edwardsville's planning decisions may influence our prosperity for years to come. Please give an Edwardsville welcome to Dr. Tim Sullivan.
Thanks, Steve. Good morning, everyone. It's always great to be here. It's great to catch up with everybody. My favorite part always is catching up with former students. And so I'm happy to be here, give you my forecasts for 2019, my predictions. The good news is that I did see my shadow this morning, which means 6 more weeks of economic growth. Right? So, what the plan is for today is to cover, first of all, sort of a recap of 2018, sort of the economic year in review. Then I want to talk to you a little bit about my forecasts for 2019. And then I want to wrap it up with a couple of things that I'm going to suggest that you keep your eye on as we transition from the winter to the spring that can give you an indication of what direction the economy is heading. Okay? So as interesting as the numbers were, I think that the headlines might have been more interesting in 2018. So what did we see in 2018? Well, we saw the full implementation of the 2017 tax, which had sort of major changes in both corporate taxes and individual income taxes. 2018 saw the beginning of what many folks are calling a trade war with China. Now, what's interesting about this is it's not just sort of the usual discussions about how many tons of American beans the Chinese will promise to buy, but it's some fairly contentious discussions about things like Chinese government industrial policy and technology transfers, and I think that's part of the reason that they have been so contentious and are still going on. 2018 saw the invocation of Section 232 of the Trade Acts for implementing steel and aluminum tariffs. The reason this is interesting is Section 232 is the National Security Clause. And so this was invoked. It's a very unusual thing to invoke this. It's especially unusual that it wasn't invoked to implement tariffs just against countries like Russia and China, but NATO allies, including, for instance, Canada. Okay? And finally, 2018, I think I find this interesting just to show how much the energy sector has changed in North America, that in 2018, the U.S. became a net exporter of refined petroleum products, okay? Something that I think 10 years ago would have been unimaginable. Okay? As far as the numbers go, the economy continued to grow, and in fact, it grew at a very healthy rate. Here, I have to call a little time out here. Among other things, the government shutdown put the Commerce Department about a month behind schedule in releasing some of their numbers, so you'll notice some of my figures here aren't as up to date as they normally would be. But at least if these figures stick through the final quarter in the revisions, U.S. GDP grew, at least for the first 3 quarters, at a 3.3% real rate. If that number sticks, that'll be the highest GDP growth since 2005. The state of Illinois, again, at least for the first half of the year, grew at 3.6%. That would be the highest, fastest economic growth since 1999, if that number can stick for the second half of the year. This was higher than most of us were forecasting. You can see my forecast there from last year. It's a good chunk higher than what most folks were forecasting. Again, if these numbers stick, it'll be thought of as one of the stronger economies since the turn of the century. Labor markets continued to be very, very strong. So unemployment at the national level for the year is the lowest it's been since the Vietnam era. Okay, so we are in a historic time period in terms of low unemployment. For Illinois and Madison County, again, if the numbers stick through the end of the revisions, we're looking at the lowest annual unemployment rate since 2000. Okay. So again, unemployment is having a great year. Okay. Stock market, not so much. The stock market had a weird year. It started off where it left off. I don't know if you could see that big drop at the early of the year. I don't know if you remember, that was the day before last year's forecast breakfast. So that's what everybody was talking about a year ago. It recovered throughout the summer, but then had a really, really, really bad fall. Autumn, fall. Then it did have another bad fall in December, which was a historically bad month. It rebounded a little bit, ended up about 6-7% off for the year, but again, the stock market had sort of a crazy year. So, of course, that leads us to ask, where are we? What's in store for 2019? How long can it last? Does this economy have, is it like Tom Brady, that it always seems to have one more year in it? Sorry. Or is it me when it's at the 30-minute mark on the treadmill, right? So where are we right now? Okay. Well, to put it into context, real GDP has now grown for 18 consecutive quarters. That's nowhere near a record, but that's a legit expansion. Okay. It's long enough that people are asking, can this, does it have the legs to keep going? U.S., the labor markets, employment has now grown in the U.S. for 100 consecutive months. I know the slide says 99. The new data came out on Friday, so we hit 100. Okay, that's a record. In fact, it's double the second best. Okay, this is a data series that goes back to the 30s, and this is the longest period of month-to-month growth in employment going back to the 30s. Okay, so again, labor markets are on a historic run. Unemployment has been at 5% or lower for over 3 years now. Again, that's an historically long time, not an all-time record, but that is a long time for unemployment to be that low. So, how long can it last? What are my predictions? Well, a year ago, I remember standing here and saying that the previous day's stock market problem was notwithstanding, that I saw absolutely nothing in the economic data that led me to believe that the market was, that the economy was going to slow down or go into recession. The way I put it last year was that everything was green. Everything on the control panel was green. I wish I could say that this year. What I can say is it's mostly green. Okay? There are a number of things that still look good. I'll talk about some of those in a minute, that lead me to believe that we're still going to be, that this economy has another year of legs to it, that it's going to grow for another year. But there are a couple of things that if I wouldn't describe as red at the national level, I certainly would describe as yellow. And so there are a few things that have me wondering if maybe we're going to slow down a little bit this year. Okay? Things to know about my forecast model. It's purely quantitative, looks at patterns, trends, correlations. What that means is I'm not trying to figure out how change in control at the House of Representatives might affect the economy. I'm not trying to outguess what policies the new governor might pursue and how that might affect the economy. I look at the numbers and I don't try to predict the other stuff. Okay? The second thing is that it's always changing, especially right now when we're sort of filling in the backlog of numbers from the shutdown. What that means is that if 2 weeks from today you see me having breakfast at Sergeant Pepper's and you say, hey Tim, how's the economy looking? You might get a different answer I give you today because the new numbers continue to roll in. So my forecasts for 2019. So I'm forecasting that U.S. Real GDP will grow at about 2.9%. Okay? That's, again, it would be slower than 2018. I think the phrase I'm fishing for here might be the foot coming off the accelerator, but not really pressing on the brake. I think that's the way I would describe it. I think we'll see, again, the economy slow down from last year, but I'm not seeing enough things in the data at this point, at least, that make me worried about a recession or a real slowdown. Again, my models are showing about a 15% chance of recession. That's not unusual. That would be fairly typical. Okay? Historically, for the last 15, 20 years, Illinois growth and Madison County growth have lagged the nation as a whole, and I don't see anything special in the numbers that make me think that's going to change in a fundamental way. So I'm forecasting slower growth for the state and the county than I am for the nation. But again, these would be fairly strong, actually, compared to the last 15 years. How do my forecasts compare with everybody else's? Well, you can see, again, I'm predicting that the economy will slow from 2018, but I'm still fairly optimistic. You can see that my forecasts are sort of on the upper edge of where other folks are. Okay? Not to prove the truth in Steve's joke here, but I always say that decimal points are proof that economists have a sense of humor, right? So 2.9, I'm not going to stand and say it's 2.9 and 2.7 is wrong or 2.8. Frankly, I think anything in the twos is a perfectly reasonable forecast, but my models are showing 2.9, okay? Again, other folks are looking at somewhat slower predictions, somewhat higher probabilities of a recession, okay? Well, where I want to finish up then in the last 5 minutes is I want to sort of give you a couple of things to suggest that you keep an eye on for the early part of the year that might give you an indication of what direction the economy is going. So if forecasting the economy is a game show, a really bad idea for a game show, I want to send you home with the home version you can play in your living room, okay? So that's what I want to give you. Is a couple of things that you can track as we move again from the winter to the spring that can see whether the economy maybe is going to tap the brakes or if it's got the legs. Okay? The first thing is consumer sentiment. Okay? Oops, sorry. Hello? Yeah, well, there we go. Consumer sentiment. Consumer spending represents about 2/3 of GDP. So what that means is if consumers are feeling good about their situation, they're likely to be spending money, okay? And that provides a certain backstop against a slowdown, against a hard slowdown. So as long as consumers are feeling good, we can feel pretty good about the direction that the economy will be heading. Okay? And one of the best measures of how consumers are feeling is the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment results. Okay? So this is it's a survey that the University of Michigan takes every year. It's a big survey of consumers, just regular folks, and they call them up and they ask them various questions about how they're feeling about the economy. They take all those answers, they put them together, and they come up with a number where the more optimistic folks are, the higher the number is, the more pessimistic they are, the lower the number is. Okay? If you want to track this, probably the easiest way is if you just Google University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment, you'll find it. If you read the Wall Street Journal, they'll have a story every month giving the latest numbers. Or if you want to shoot me an email at the university, I'd be happy to send you a link that you could track it and get an email update every month. Okay? So what I did here was I graphed this number going back to the 70s. Okay? So if you look all the way to the right, you'll see where we are today, where it's relatively high. It's in the 90s, okay, which is a good reading. Then what I did to just illustrate why this is worth tracking is I marked with an arrow the 8 times, going back to the 70s, that consumer sentiment has been similar to where it is now, in the 90s. Okay? And so you'll see those 8 arrows. Then what I did was I color-coded the arrows. If the economy went into a recession within a year after that time period, I coded it as red. And if the economy continued to grow for the following year, then I marked it as green. Okay? So what I think most of you have noticed is that 7 out of those 8 arrows are green. right? Which is why this is a worthwhile thing to track. Again, you can see that when consumers are feeling fairly good about things, as they do now, that for the most part, recessions aren't impossible. They're not unheard of, but it would be fairly unusual. Okay. On the other hand, if you see this start to drop, and it did drop last month, it dropped from the upper 90s to the lower 90s, but if we see it drop again, say to the 80s, and if by the time we get to maybe April it's falling into the low 80s or the upper 70s, then that's an indication that maybe somebody is tapping the brakes and that we might need to worry about a recession this year. Okay? Then the other thing I'm going to urge you to keep your eye on is interest rate spreads. Now, I really hate the fact that the last thing I'm going to talk to you about this morning is interest rates, because everybody in this room who's not a banker or a financial advisor is going to doze in about 2 minutes here. So let me bring all my skills in front of the classroom to bear here and try to explain this in a way that doesn't put you to sleep. Okay? It starts off with a basic pattern for interest rates. And this pattern is that all else equal, long-term interest rates tend to be higher than short-term interest rates. Okay? Now, you can see this yourself the next time you're in your bank's lobby. Look for the sign where they tell you what rates they pay on their certificates of deposit, and I can virtually guarantee you that the rate, the APY, for, say, a 3-year CD will be higher than a 1-year CD. Okay? So there'll be this gap between the interest rates. Okay? Now, this gap is not just showing up in CDs at your bank. It shows up in all kinds of other investments, things like federal bonds, government bonds, federal treasuries. Okay? So there'll be this gap between the two. Okay? Now, this gap's not written in stone. It fluctuates over time depending upon how confident people are, depending upon what people think is going to happen with inflation, depending upon what the Federal Reserve is doing. And so this gap, or spread, as it's often called, can get bigger or smaller. Okay, so what I did here was I graphed a particular interest rate spread that folks often look at, and it's the difference between a 10-year federal treasury and a 3-month. Okay, so it's a measure of how those interest rates are different, and I'm showing how it has changed going back to the early 80s. Okay, the gap right now, again, if you look all the way to the right, the gap right now is very small. It's less than a percentage point. In fact, it's less than half a percentage point. It's very close to 0. Okay? Now, I did the bit again with the arrows. So I went back and I marked all the times going back to the early 80s that this number has been, this gap has been this small. I've marked them with arrows. There are 7 arrows. Okay? I did the bit again where I color-coded the arrows. And now what I bet a bunch of you are noticing is that 3 out of the 7 arrows are red. Okay? This is one of the things people are looking at that has people concerned. I've had more people ask me about interest rate spreads in the last 4 or 5 months than I can ever remember in my career. Okay? This is one of the things that has people concerned, and it's why it's one of the things that you might want to track. Again, you can find this in the Wall Street Journal, or again, shoot me an email at the university. I'd be happy to send you a link that you could track it. If this number starts to go up, that's in general a good sign in terms of economic growth. If it stays low, you can see recessions aren't guaranteed anything. I don't want to induce panic in the streets or anything, but you can see that recessions are somewhat common when it's this low. And if you're tracking it this spring and you see it not only drop, but go negative, that historically has been a problem. So you can see I've circled the 3 times that it not only went low, close to 0, but went negative. And you can see 3 for 3 going back to, again, the early 80s. The pattern was go negative, start to rebound, and then a recession starts. Okay? So that's why I think these 2 things would be good things for you to track if you want to just sort of follow at home and see where the economy is heading. Again, consumer sentiment and these interest rate spreads. Okay? I don't know how I did on the interest rate things. I see a lot of dozing, but not too bad. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure visiting with you, and I hope to talk to a lot of you after breakfast. Okay? Thank you very much.
I'm going to talk about interest rates for the next 30 minutes, so if anybody needs coffee, just grab it and we can go. I saw some people on our table reaching it a little while ago. Okay, so the plan today is to I'll give you a brief overview, just follow up on a few national outlook points, and then I want to dive deep into kind of what drives growth in a region and kind of how this general region is doing and kind of what factors we can look at to kind of get an idea of what the long-term outlook for the region looks like. Just to start out, you can see it's actually pretty small. This is my disclaimer at the bottom. So these are my views. They're not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis or the Fed system. So when it gets to Q&A, feel free to ask me anything you want, and I'll either give you my boss's talking points or I'll give you my own opinion, and I'll try to distinguish between those two. Okay, so just to kind of get started out, I think growth in 2018 was stronger than we expected. I'm going to move this box one second. From the Fed standpoint, I think we knew that there was going to be some uptick from the stimulus, and we definitely saw that in the data. As you can see here, kind of this red line is going to be the FOMC, so the Monetary Policy Committee. They submit forecasts 4 times a year for what they view the outlook for the economy to look like, so that's going to be the red line from last year. And as you can see, the growth definitely was stronger than expected. A lot of this was actually not necessarily from the tax cuts, but actually additional contributions from government spending. So we saw about half a percentage point growth in the U.S. economy was driven just by additional federal government spending coming in from additional spending, not necessarily just from the tax cut. But regardless, we did see kind of growth stronger than expected. The forecast, again, for this year is we mentioned, is 2.3% from the committee, but the expectations are that this growth is going to slow over the next couple of years. And the key factors driving this are kind of twofold. So one is going to be demographic. We just have an aging population. Labor force growth is really slow. There's just no way that with the labor force growth that we have right now that you could expect to see the economy accelerate at a faster pace. The only way that that could happen would be if we saw productivity growth really start to accelerate. Unfortunately, we've been in this stage for a very long time now where productivity growth has been very slow. There's a lot of kind of confusion as to what exactly is driving this slow productivity growth, but I could spend 3 hours talking about that, and I'm not going to do that, so we're just going to move on. But generally speaking, we expect that the economy is going to slow down to a trend rate more or less around 2%, maybe a little bit below 2%. It's about trend growth for the U.S. economy at this point. Tim mentioned the forecast. We don't have the fourth quarter numbers in yet, but I think we're going to get a number probably around 2.5% for the fourth quarter. I also made a note about that. First quarter numbers will probably get something a little less than 2%. That's going to be driven by probably some challenges in estimating seasonal factors in the wintertime, as well as about maybe 0.2 of a point off from the federal government shutdown, also dragging on growth in the first quarter. Looking at the unemployment rate forecast, it's more or less been on track. We expected some kind of slowdown. We saw that just a little bit, actually dipped a bit lower than the committee expected. And projections are actually that we still have a little bit of movement to go to get this unemployment rate down a little bit lower. Now I think long term, there's kind of these stories about this passing over into faster wage growth and tighter labor markets, and that's going to raise inflation pressures. We haven't really seen that, and there's not a lot of evidence at this point that trade-off that we saw in the 1980s and 1970s really exists today. A lot of that we kind of pat ourselves on the back for at the Fed and say that inflation expectations have become much better anchored, so businesses aren't willing to say, well, we're going to get 5% wage growth, because they know that if wage growth does accelerate too much and we see these inflation pressures, the Fed will increase interest rates to kind of slow the economy down and keep inflation in check. But we do expect to see the unemployment rate dip down just a bit more. Inflation pressures have been more or less in line with the Fed's target, so 2% is kind of the steady number that we look at. A combination of some of these tariffs on steel and aluminum, a kind of run up in energy prices earlier on in the year, kind of pushed inflation a bit above that 2%, but as you can see in the last couple months, it's came back down to the target. And again, projections are at this point that we'll kind of see that steady inflation rate about 2%. So in a lot of ways, the market is kind of at this equilibrium. So we're seeing kind of steady growth Inflation rates are about where we'd expect them, unemployment rates low, and for the most part, even though 2018 was a strong year, growth was still more or less in line with that potential rate of about 2%. So that slowdown that we saw in kind of the turmoil in the fourth quarter, a lot of it, I think, is just markets coming to realize that the growth that we had was not going to be sustainable, and the economy was going to slow back down to a level that was closer to its potential. Now, when we look at the kind of the monetary policy pieces, and this is my only slide on interest rates, I promise, we more or less followed the path that we expected. The economy moved along the path that we had projected, maybe a little bit higher on inflation, maybe a bit faster on growth, but the interest rate increases were more